Assalamu alaikum dear students. Welcome to the course Principle in Animal Life 2. This is lecture number 42. The topic is 5 agents of evolutionary change. Discussing agenda for the topic is introduction, and then we will discuss one by one the 5 agents of evolutionary change, which includes mutation, gene flow, non-random mating, genetic drift, and finally selection. Lecture outcome. After watching and listening this lecture, students will know about various agents of evolutionary change. Introduction. The 5 assumptions of the Hardy-Weinberg principle also indicate the 5 agents that can lead to evolutionary change in populations. First, we redefine evolution. It is the process during which change occurs in the genetic composition of a population through successive generations. It is the process in which change occurs in the genotype and allelic frequencies of the population over time. In our previous lectures, we discussed Hardy-Weinberg principle and its applications. Hardy-Weinberg principle says that the genotype and the allelic frequency or the genetic composition of a population will not change through successive generations if certain conditions are fulfilled. And then we discussed those conditions. So if those conditions are violated, then they results in bringing change in the genotype and allelic frequencies of the populations. And if those 5 conditions are kept under control, then the Hardy-Weinberg equation will apply to a population. So what are those 5 agents? You already know about it, but here we will study them in a slightly different perspective. In the Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium, we discussed them, how to check and balance these 5 mechanisms, agents, so that no evolutionary change can occur. Here we will discuss how each of them leads to evolution. So what are those 5 agents? They are mutations, gene flow, non-random mating, genetic drift in small populations, pressure of natural selection. Now, these are the agents of evolutionary change, and if you want to make them as conditions for Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium, then you will have to put here no mutation, no gene flow, random mating, large population size, and no natural selection. Then they will become the conditions for Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium. Now they are the agents for the evolutionary change. Any one of these may bring about changes in allele or genotype proportions, causing the population to not be in Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium. So they bring about changes in the genetic composition of the populations, and if any one of them is allowed, then the population will not remain in the Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium, because the frequencies will change through successive generations. So here is a diagrammatic representation of the 5 different mechanisms of the evolutionary change. In the subsequent slides, we will discuss each one of them in detail. The first one is mutations. Now, what is mutation? I hope all of you already know. Mutation is a change in the genetic material of a cell or an organism. Majority of the mutations are harmful. They are at times lethal, and they decreases the fitness of an organism. They results in the death of the organism. However, certain mutations brings about some favorable changes in an organism, and those changes are selected by nature, and these changes persist in the population because they give them survival advantage to the individuals and reproductive success. So such favorable traits are spread in the population through the reproduction in individuals having such traits. Mutation rates are generally so low that they have little effect on the Hardy-Weinberg proportions of common alleles. If you remember from the DNA replication topic, we discussed that several mutations arises in our genes. Some of them are spontaneous, they arises on their own, whereas others are induced. So these spontaneous mutations are usually rectified by the proofreading ability of the DNA polymerases, and certain induced mutations are so harmful that they results in the death of the individual. So they have negligible effects on the genetic composition of the population. However, mutations are the source of all new alleles. Alleles are the different variants of a gene. They are the alternative forms of a gene, and new allele arises through mutations. A typical gene mutates about once per 100,000 cell divisions, so that gives you a good idea about how slow this process is. Because this rate is so low, other evolutionary processes are usually more important in determining how allele frequencies change. This process is very slow, and therefore the changes it brings about in the genetic composition is almost negligible or difficult to determine. Nonetheless, mutation is the ultimate source of genetic variation, and thus makes evolution possible. As we say that Mutations provide raw material for evolution. They bring about changes in the genes, and then natural selection assess where those changes brought about by mutation are useful for that organism or harmful, and then subsequently the fate of the individual having those mutations is determined. One thing to remember here is that mutations occur unpredictably and spontaneously. Means no one is sure when a mutation is going to strike the genetic material, what will be its consequences, whether it will be a useful one or a harmful one. So it is a process which is not predetermined. A particular locus may have a DNA sequence that cause certain types of mutations to occur more frequently than others. There are certain spots in our genetic material, in our genome, which are called mutational hot spots. They are more vulnerable to changes as compared to other such spots. When an individual with such a mutation, not all mutations pass from one generation to next generation. Remember this, mutations can occur both in somatic and germ cells, but the mutations which are there in the germ cells or the reproductive cells, only such type of mutations are passed on to the next generation. The second is gene flow. Gene flow simply means migration. When an individual migrate from one area to another, so the genes carried by that individual also move from one area to another. So you can refer to it as migration or gene flow. Now, how gene flow affects the genotype frequencies? Gene flow is the movement of alleles from one population to another. It can be a powerful agent of evolutionary change. Sometimes gene flow is obvious, as when an animal physically moves from one place to another. The subtler movements include the drifting of gametes or the immature stages of plants or marine animals from one place to another. So migration or the gene flow can also occur when there is a mass movement of organisms from one area to another, and in a smaller level when the gametes flow in water from one area to another, or immature plants they move from one area to another. So this is also regarded as gene flow and migration. Pollen, the male gamete of flowering plant, is often carried great distances by insects and other animals that visit flowers. So here this flower is, you can see the colors are different, so we can assume that both the flowers belong to different species, and this is the honey bee, which is responsible for pollination. So the honey bee uh, yield nectar from this flower, then some of the pollen grains are attached with the legs of this honeybee, and when it moves to a different flower, then those pollen grains are released, and they can aid to a change in the genotype frequency and the allelic frequency, because the flower here is of pink color, so the allele responsible for pink color is introduced in that population because of migration, because of gene flow. So uh, before migration, this population only had allele that determines this particular flower color. Now, after migration, a new allele which is responsible for pink color is introduced. So the allelic and genotype frequency of the parent population, original population, is changed. Now, if the characteristics of the newly arrived individuals differ from those of the ones that are already there, so then this will result in change in genetic composition. So obviously the characteristics of both the populations are different, and if a gene is introduced from this area, then it will definitely induce changes in the genotype frequencies. Now, let me give you an example from animals in this regard. Suppose this is a population of birds, and their genotype is AA, AA. So the birds are living in a particular area, and this is their genotype. Now another bird from another population arrives here, and this bird is carrying this particular genotype. So this genotype is not present in the receiving population, and it was added only after the arrival of the new immigrants. So this individual will settle here, it will mate with the members of this particular population, and in this way this particular allele will be introduced into that population, and it will result in the genetic diversity, it will result in the change in the genetic composition, and thus evolution will occur. Migration tends to reduce differences in allele frequencies between neighboring populations. How? Now, if this is the original population from where it migrated, then the original population will have this genotype. So if the members of this population also visit this area, then they will introduce this particular genotype here in that population. So what will happen? The migration between those two populations will result in the similarities in the genetic composition. And if there is a barrier, suppose this bird somehow managed to reach this population, but then a barrier established and the communication between the two populations was not possible, then this population will evolve into a different species and it will become an example of allopatric speciation. But if the migration between the two populations is continuous, then with the passage of time, the genetic composition of both the populations tends to be more similar. Consider two populations initially different in allele frequencies just described. One population is having this frequency for one allele and this frequency for another allele. The other population, the allelic frequency is changed, so these are two different populations. Now what will be the effect of migration on the allelic frequencies in those two populations? Gene flow brings alleles into a population in proportion to their frequency in the source population. So if a particular population has greater number of individuals having a particular allele, then their migration, more individuals will migrate from that particular area and more alleles will be added to the new receiving population. If the original population has lesser frequency of a particular allele, then their effect on the other populations will also be lesser. In this case, it would disproportionately bring in alleles that are rare in the recipient population because those alleles are common in the source population. Now here two different populations, they are living in different areas. One population is having lesser frequency for one allele, the other population is having greater frequency for the same allele. And when migration occurs, some of the members from this population migrated to that population, then what will happen? They will alter, they will disturb the allelic frequency because the incoming individuals, the allelic frequency for that particular gene is higher, so they will disturb the allelic frequency of the population to whom they migrated. Similarly will be the case here. If members of population 1 migrate to population 2, then they will also disturb the allelic frequency here. Thus allelic frequencies would change from generation to generation and the population would not be in Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium. Only when allele frequencies reach 0.5 for both alleles in both populations will equilibrium be attained. So if the number of individuals from that population migrating to this one is equal to the number of individuals migrating from this population to here, then what will happen? With the passage of time, both the populations will tend to have similar genetic composition and there will be no difference in their allele and genotype frequencies. And similarly within a population, the allele frequencies for both alleles will tend to be equal. Now it's not equal. This example also indicates that gene flow tends to homogenize allele frequencies among populations, but this gene flow should be by on both sides. Members of population 1 should migrate here and the ones from population 2 should migrate here. Only then the frequencies will become similar. If it is a one way migration, then the frequency of the receiving populations will change. If the receiving population is lacking the allele which is introduced by the immigrants. The third one is non-random mating. In Hardy-Weinberg theorem, we discussed random mating as a process in which one particular individual of any genotype or phenotype has equal opportunity of mating with any other individual of the opposite sex in that population. So if such a strategy is applicable within a population, then the allelic and genotype frequencies will not change. But if the individuals chooses their potential mates on the basis of certain conditions, that is similarity in phenotype, or because of close relatedness, or because of some other unique features which are not prevalent in all members, like long horns, beautiful camouflage, etc. So if there is sexual selection involved, then it will disturb the genotype and allelic frequencies and the population will evolve. So individuals with certain genotypes sometimes mate with one another more commonly. Means there is non-random mating. Random mating means haphazard, equal opportunity for everyone to mate with other individual in the population of the opposite sex. But if there is a selection process involved, then it is called as non-random mating, and it becomes one of the agents of the evolutionary change. So here is an example. Now suppose, in fact it is a pea plant. In pea plant self and cross pollination occurs. So if this particular plant practices self-pollination more commonly than cross-pollination, then it will be considered as random mating. Non-random mating if its pollen grains are detached and they are carried by wind to another pea plant flower which is white in color, then it will be random mating. But in this case the gamete are belonging to the same genetic makeup, so therefore that will give rise to this particular condition. And in humans we usually call this condition as consanguineous matings or marriages, that is the marriages between close cousins, and it also gave rise to a condition which is harmful for the plants, that is inbreeding depression. This phenomena, breeding between close relatives, is known as inbreeding, and its consequences, its effect is inbreeding depression. Inbreeding depression results in lesser hybrid vigor. It decreases the variation in the population, and then with the passage of time, the individuals of the population loses the genetic variabilities. So assortative mating is a phenomena in which phenotypically similar individuals mate, just like here, and it can be there also in animals. Assortative mating will increase the proportion of homozygotes in the next generation. So if the self-pollination occurs on regular basis, then the individual will lose the genetic variability and their genotype will become same with the passage of time or more closely associated. So assortative mating does not change the frequency of individual alleles because it does not change the reproductive success of individuals. So why assortative mating results in increased proportion of homozygotes in next generation? The answer is because phenotypically similar individuals are likely to be genetically similar. Phenotypically similar individuals are likely to be genetically similar, and thus are also more likely to produce offsprings with two copies of the same allele. Inbreeding results when closely related individuals mate with each other. We call it as consanguineous marriages in human populations. Now, inbreeding will have the same result as assortative mating and increase the proportion of homozygotes. So the chances of occurrence of genetic disorders is higher in families that practice consanguineous marriages, because consanguineous marriages helps in the appearance of alleles in homozygous condition. In fact, because relatives tend to be phenotypically similar, assortative mating can lead to inbreeding or loss in genetic vigor. By contrast, disassortative mating, in which phenotypically different individuals mate, produces an excess of heterozygotes and increased genetic variability. The next one is genetic drift. The most important thing related with this agent is that it is more effective in small populations as compared to large populations. What is genetic drift? Genetic drift is a change in the allelic or genotype frequency of a population. It is a sudden change which occurs all of a sudden because of natural calamities like floods, starvation, or overpredation, when certain alleles are lost from a population. How an allele is lost from a population? When individuals carrying that particular allele dies away, then we say that that allele has been lost from the population. So here you can see this is the original population, which is having different alleles for determining the color. One is determining yellow, the other is determining red. Now if some of the members of that population migrate to a new destination, then this population will have a lesser genetic variability as compared to the parent population. And suppose this population suffered from some kind of natural calamity, that is, there was attack of the predators, or these individuals passed away in some other events, then what will happen? The new population left after the disaster will not have these two individuals. As a result, these two individuals and the allele carrying them will be lost from the population. But remember that it is only going to happen if the population is a small one. Suppose if this population has 100,000 individuals, then genetic drift is not effective, because the death of few individuals of a particular genotype will not result in the elimination of that allele from the population. In small populations, frequency of particular alleles may change drastically by chance alone. Chance means by certain natural calamities like overpredation, diseases, floods, starvation. Such changes in allele frequencies occur randomly, as if the frequencies were drifting from their values. So these changes brings about a change in the allele and genotype frequencies. They results in the elimination of certain alleles from the population, and therefore the genotype and allelic frequencies of the remaining population are disturbed and they changes. So this phenomena is called genetic drift. This is the condition for Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium, and if the population size is small, then genetic drift brings about profound changes in small populations, and evolution occurs. But if population size is larger, then death of few individuals won't make any change to the genetic and allelic frequencies. So the smaller the population, the greater the change in allele frequencies from generation to generation as a result of genetic drift. In small populations, frequencies of particular alleles may change drastically by chance alone. So one more important thing here to mention is that genetic drift is one of the mechanisms or agents responsible for evolutionary change, but the changes brought about by genetic drift in genotype and allelic frequencies are random. They are not beneficial, they may be harmful. For example, you can see here, if that population passes through some natural calamities, then it may the natural calamities may result in the death of individuals in those population. Now maybe individuals having favorable traits are killed, individuals having harmful traits are killed. So both situations are equally applicable here. So they just bring about changes in the genotype and allele frequencies, and the changes may be useful or harmful, and they can either increase the genetic variability, or genetic drift can also decrease the genetic variability. One allele may be eliminated from the population purely by chance, regardless of whether the allele is beneficial, harmful, or of no particular advantage or disadvantage. So the natural disaster, the natural calamities, they results in mortalities and deaths, irrespective of the importance of the individual or the features the individual have that makes him more adaptable to the environment. So the changes may be harmful or useful. Now this is one of the worst consequences of genetic drift. If population size is small and it faces natural calamities, then the individuals which are having less allele frequencies, if they lost their lives, then it will result in lesser genetic variation in that population. Similarly, genetic drift can also introduce a harmful allele in a population. Suppose if the natural calamity resulted in the death of individuals that are having the useful allele, then the remaining ones which have the harmful alleles, they after the disaster will reunite, and they will increase their population. Obviously their genetic variability will be much lesser as compared to the original population before the disaster, and similarly the alleles they had will be spread in the members of the population, and a time will come when this harmful allele will become the part of the genetic makeup of all individuals of that population. So genetic drift can also fix harmful alleles in the population in this way. If individuals having useful alleles are killed in the tragic events, and the ones having harmful alleles, they survive this tragedy and then they reproduce again and again. So then the population after the disaster will have individuals that have this harmful allele. Now, genetic drift can take place in two ways. The first is founder effect. Founder effect occurs when a few individuals become isolated from a larger population. Few individuals, they migrated, they moved to other locations, they left the parent population. Allele frequencies in small founder population can be different from those in the larger parent population. A parent population is having 4 or 5 different alleles for determining the coat color, and suppose we are taking an example of the rabbits, and they are having 4 or 5 different alleles that determines the coat color. And if some of the individuals of the population migrate to other areas, then it is not necessary that this population will have a representative of each of the alleles for the coat color. Maybe individuals that have only 1 or 2 alleles of the parent population out of 5 migrate. So what will happen? The population which migrated to the new destination will have lesser genetic variability as compared to the parent population. Let me explain it with the help of the pen. This is the original parent population, and it is having 5 alleles, 5 different alleles that determines the coat color. Now, if some individuals migrate to other population, then maybe those migrants only carry 1 or 2 alleles for the coat color and not all 5 of them. So the allelic frequency in the small founder population can be different from those in the larger population. These pioneers are not likely to carry all the alleles present in the source population. Thus, some alleles may be lost from the new population and others may change drastically in frequency. So now this population arrived at this new environment. Obviously, it will have to settle there, adapt to the prevailing environmental conditions, and when they were living in the parent population, they were well adopted, and the traits they had, the alleles they had, were perfectly suited to the environment, but then they found a new destination, a new environment. So once again there will be a process of adaptation, and some of the alleles will be lost from this population, and there may be the introduction of new alleles or the incorporation of new alleles, and their subsequent selection by the nature. So this phenomena in which the allele frequencies of the founding individuals are different from the allele frequencies in the population from which they came is called founder effect. Founder effects are not rare in nature. Many self-pollinating plants start new populations from a single seed. Founder effects have been particularly important in the evolution of organisms on distinct oceanic islands such as the Hawaiian Island in the US and the Galapagos Island, where some of the members of the parent population migrated and they found diverse habitats and then they adapted accordingly. Remember the example of the 14 species of finches which are found in the Galapagos Island, and their ancestor migrated to the Galapagos Island from the South American mainland. So most of the organisms in such areas probably derive from one or a few initial founders, although rare. Such events are occasionally observed, such as when a mass of vegetation carrying several iguanas washed away up on the shore of the Caribbean island in 1996, leading to the establishment of a population that still occurs there to this day. So this is one of the examples. The Galapagos Island is named so because it is home to large tortoises. And the word Galapagos itself means tortoise. So even till date there are various theories that the South American mainland and the Galapagos Island is separated by a 900-kilometer stretch, and there is water in between. So how those tortoises, those large tortoises, migrated there to Galapagos Island, because there is no land connection, how they managed to migrate 900 kilometers from the South American mainland to the Galapagos Island. It is a different story, but here you can refer to it as when the members of the parent population migrates to diverse environments, habitats, then they adopt there accordingly and their allelic and genotype frequencies changes. Another one is, this is a second type of genetic drift. Bottleneck is a sudden reduction in population size due to change in the environment, such as natural disasters. Suppose this is the original population. You can see there are the balls of three different colors, blue and white and a third color, and then this bottleneck means that this population came across a drastic natural calamity, that is excessive hunting or overpredation or rough environmental situations or drought or starvation or infectious diseases. Then what happened? Only few individuals were able to survive, and majority of the members died as a result of this calamity. So we can relate to it as if these balls are passing through this difficult phase, and very few of them managed to came out. So this also results in change in the genetic composition. Now, so these are the only surviving individuals that survived this calamity, and you can see here, if you compare it with the original parent population, there are balls of three different colors. The ball represent the alleles, and the surviving population is having balls of two different colors, so means one of the alleles was lost in this tragic event from the population. Here is an example. The northern elephant seals, they have a thick layer of fat beneath their skin, and they were hunted excessively because of this, and a time came when even their population decreased so much it was on the verge of extinction, and there were few elephant seals. They managed to survive living on this particular island. So this population was once thriving, and then it came across this tragic events like hunting. Their population decreased significantly, and only 20 individuals on that island managed to survive, and as a result, now they have much less genetic variability as compared to the original population before the hunting events. So the bottleneck affect the surviving population. If found conditions beneficial, then they can regain the number which was there before the tragic event. But the alleles which were lost in this tragic event cannot be regained, they cannot be replaced. Another example which we can mention here is that of tigers. There is so much less genetic variation in tigers that you can transplant a skin graft from one tiger to another tiger, because their genotypes are so much similar. Normally it is only possible in identical twins, but in tigers it is possible for the less genetic variability. Why there is less genetic variability in tigers? Because once upon a time, 10,000 years ago, they suffered certain natural calamities which significantly reduced their number, and they were also on the verge of extinction. And then one or two of the surviving populations managed to increase their number with the passage of time, but they were unable to regain the same genetic variability which was present before the calamity. So these are the different effects of the genetic drift. They have significant effect in small populations. The change in allele frequency is random. Sometimes beneficial alleles are also lost. Genetic drift can lead to loss of genetic variation within population. If certain individuals that are having unique alleles are killed, then genetic variability is decreased, and the remaining individuals which have harmful alleles reproduce again and again, and as a result harmful allele is fixed in the population. I have already discussed this point in detail. The fifth one, and probably the most important one, is natural selection. This is the mechanism which helped Darwin revolutionize the field of biology. Now, natural selection, let me give you an example, that all the other four agents, they bring about change in the genotype and allelic frequencies. Now, which change is useful and which one is harmful? it is decided by natural selection. So the change brought about by natural selection is always beneficial, always adaptive. As Darwin pointed out, some individuals leave behind more progeny than others, and the rate at which they do so is affected by their phenotype. Darwin said that some individuals which have certain beneficial inherited traits have more survival success and higher reproductive chances as compared to others because those traits are selected by the environment, by the nature, and they enables them, the organisms, to thrive successfully. So natural selection is when individuals with one phenotype leave on average more surviving offsprings in the next generation than individuals with an alternative phenotype. Means certain inherited traits are favored by nature and others are not. So the individuals having the favored traits will have at a greater advantage of surviving and reproduction than others. In artificial selection, which is practiced nowadays and which was practiced over 5,000 years ago, where the breeders select two beneficial varieties and then they crossbreed them with an intention to introduce the favorable traits in the offsprings. So similar kind of situation also occurs on the natural level, which is natural selection, that is environmental conditions determine which individuals in a population produce the most offsprings. Obviously environmental conditions and natural selection will favor those individuals that have traits that makes them more adaptable to the prevailing environmental conditions. So phenotypic variation must exist among individuals in a population. Natural selection works by favoring individuals with some traits over individuals with alternative traits. If no variation exists, natural selection cannot operate. Selection only works when there is variation. If there is no variation, suppose if the marks of the students are same, they are equal, then it is difficult to determine who is the topper or the number one. Variation among individuals must result in differences in number of offspring surviving in the next generation. Now, this is natural selection. Because of their phenotype or behavior, some individuals are more successful than others in producing offsprings. Although many traits are phenotypically variable, individuals exhibiting variations do not always differ in survival and reproductive success. Generally, we can assume that individuals that have variations in their phenotypic traits will also have variations in the survival and in their reproductive success. Phenotypic variations must have a genetic basis. Now, for natural selection to result in evolutionary change, the selected differences must have a genetic basis. Not all variations has a genetic basis because at times variations also occur as a result of the environmental effects. So such variations are not going to lead to natural selection. Even genetically identical individuals may be phenotypically quite distinct if they grow up in different environments. So such environmental effects are common in nature. The video time is getting too much. I think we should wind up it here. Thank you very much for your time. Allah Hafiz.